A yes vote on November would limit increases in state tax revenue. A no vote would leave state tax laws unchanged. That sounds a lot more simple than it is. The move to limit state tax revenue growth to the level of growth in total wages and salaries and to repeal the state surtax over 2 years is opposed by Governor Dukakis and the legislature. And that, of course, has led to plenty of political positioning on Beacon Hill. One of our guests today, Barbara Anderson from Citizens for Limited Taxation, supports Question 3. State Senator Richard Kraus from Arlington opposes it. Let me ask you two first to make the arguments for your case and explain your position. Ms. Anderson?
Actually, it is very simple. The yes vote on Question 3 is a vote to limit state tax revenues to no more than the growth in Massachusetts workers' wages and salaries. And so if people vote yes on Question 3, they're simply saying that they think state tax revenues should not go up any faster than our growth in wages and salaries. And presumably a no vote says that no, I think that state tax revenue should go up faster than our growth in wages and salaries averaged over 3 years, and that is really all there is to it.
Andy, the tax cap that's on the ballot is very seriously flawed. Take a long time to go through all of those flaws. I think the one that's probably most important for your viewers is that it really ignores the fact that state government today is financing a very substantial portion of local government. For the last 5 years, since the adoption of Proposition 2.5, state government has been pouring a lot of money into local government. As a matter of fact, if you look at the numbers, you see that state spending for its own purposes have been under the cap that's proposed by this referendum item. And the excess that we've gathered over and above the growth of wages and salaries has gone to local government in order to make Proposition 2.5 work. The suggestion here is that that money, which we've been transferring to local government, we don't collect anymore. We send back and leave local government short.
Barbara, aren't you really reducing this to sort of the lowest common denominator and sort of relying on people's knee-jerk response to tax cap, a limit on state revenues without really having them understand the consequences of that kind of cap?
Joni, I really don't understand what the concern is about this, because what I say it does is exactly what it does. It's a state tax limit that says if growth in wages and salaries, as it was last year, was 9.4%, then state tax revenues cannot go up 15.8% the way they did last year. They can only go up 9.4%. You can't be any more simple than that. Senator Kraus talks somehow about a threat to Proposition 2.5. Nobody is more concerned about Proposition 2.5 than I am, and I am not going to do anything to threaten what I work so hard to get. The fact is, if we continue to spend the way we're spending now beyond our growth in wages and salaries, then this state is going to spend itself again into a fiscal crisis like it did in 74, 75. And when that happens, there will not be the money for local aid that is necessary to keep Proposition 2.5 strong, and we are concerned about that. We want to keep the economy stable.
What do you think about his point, though, that Proposition 2.5 has worked, essentially, because the state government has stepped in and given money to the local government?
They didn't step in. They did what they were supposed to do, and we said this many times in the 2.5 campaign. We expect the state to share its revenues. That's part of its job, what it should be doing within the growth of wages and salaries with cities and towns. We want to make sure that continues. If they spend themselves into a fiscal crisis, as they did in the past, when they spent growth revenues beyond the growth in wages and salaries, there won't be money for local aid, and 2.5 is threatened. That is the last thing we want after what we went through to get Proposition 2.5.
Joni, the simple fact is that today government spending in Massachusetts is below the growth of wages and salaries. What we have is a situation in which local government, the revenues coming in, are limited far below that rate of growth. State revenues are exceeding that rate of growth somewhat. And simply we're moving the money out of the place where it's above into the place where it's below. And if you look at the total that state and local government are raising in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for the last 5 years, it has been well below the rate of growth of salaries and wages. Now, Barbara says it's doing what it's supposed to do. I tried Kool-Aid the other day. I want to try money. What's happening at the present time is if you were to limit government spending in Massachusetts to the growth of wages and salaries, you would say that, okay, state government would be going up a dime and local government would be going up a dime. The problem is that the revenues for local government are only a nickel. And what we have a situation in which state government is coming in at 15 cents, that nickel is being moved over to local government at the present time, so that both are under the cap that's being proposed. What she's suggesting is that we take away this nickel, and that somehow that is supposed to leave people so that they'll be able to function and everything will be fine. It's simply wrong. If you only look at the revenues for state government, then one of the two must be left in a position where they have no chance at all to keep up
But
with
that's what we're
the
looking
rate
at.
of
This
wages
is a cap,
and salaries.
This is a cap on state tax revenues. The cap on property tax is already done. People decided when they voted for Prop 2.5 that local taxes will go up 2.5% plus growth in construction, which has been about 5%, which is faster than the growth in inflation. Now we're doing a state tax cap, and we're being very generous. We're not holding them to the rate of inflation, or 2.5% or 5%. We're saying you can have the growth in wages and salaries, which is more than 2 times the rate of inflation. But that's the state cap. And we're being very generous in allowing, we could say it goes up with the CPI, but we're not. We're letting it go up at 9.4% over the last few years.
And that cap would work if, in fact, state government stopped supplementing local government.
But couldn't
we
the argument
cannot do
be
that.
made that, that's really 2 questions. Couldn't the argument be made that why make that nickel the nickel that goes from the state government to the local governments? Why not say that the first nickel the state government gets goes to the local governments, the second nickel the state government gets stays with the state governments, and there's your dime? Why does it have to be that third nickel that goes to... Do you see what I'm trying to ask?
I see what you're suggesting, Andy, and I think that really does get at the heart of the matter. If government spending in Massachusetts is to be limited to the rate of growth of wages and salaries, there needs to be 20 cents on the table. Okay? That's what brings us up to that level. If you take away one of those nickels, okay, then the total of government spending can never, ever be up to the level of the growth of wages and
And
salaries.
there's no reason
It must
it should
always be less.
Respond to that.
Of course, there's no reason it should be. Nobody's saying that total state tax revenue should go up to the growth of wages and salaries. We're saying at the local level, it's capped at 2.5% plus growth in construction, plus there's an override available, obviously, at the local level if they want it. That's one whole subject. That's been done and is taken care of. At the state level, we're saying that state tax revenues cannot go up faster than our growth in wages and salaries, and certainly we expect the state to continue to share its revenues as part of its overall function with the cities and towns.
Let me tell you something. I said it wasn't simple. You said it was. I'm thinking of a viewer, and I'm thinking, boy, even if they see those nickels and they're sitting with them, they're in trouble right now. You know, so
Well,
let me...
yeah,
so
legislature
try again.
The legislature is trying to confuse it. You know, I'm not going to try to confuse something just so I can sound like I'm dealing with a complicated issue here, and I understand no one else does. It's a simple issue. Do we want state tax revenues to go up at the rate of growth of wages and salaries or faster? And within that limit, they are to spend money on things that we consider essential. Prisons, infrastructure, paying off their debt, and certainly sharing local aid with the cities and towns. Nothing has changed. This will allow growth every year in state tax revenues, but they can't have state tax revenues going up almost 16% when our wages and salaries are only going up 9.4% as they did the last few
What
years.
about people who have other priorities other than prisons and the other two that you
You mean
ticked
like
off?
rainy day?
No, what about things like, some people care about education, for example, the public schools. Some people care about, local services.
Julie, they've got $10 billion in state tax revenues that they get to keep. We're not cutting anything with this. This is not a tax cut. This is not a tax revolt. They get to keep what they've got now, and every year they're allowed an increase relative to our growth in wages and salaries. But they can't increase faster than our growth in wages and salaries. You can't get more reasonable than that. If they want more than that, then, the legislature obviously can override this, but they have to somehow justify taking more from us than our own taxpayers' growth in wages and salaries.
And Johnny, it clearly is a tax cut, and that's exactly what's wanted. As long as you don't have the 20 cents on the table, it's a tax cut. At the present time, we do. At the present time, we have a situation in which both state and local government have an opportunity to roughly keep up with the growth of wages and
Won't
salaries.
people get money back as a result? And doesn't that equal tax cut?
Oh, no.
Goes away.
Only-
Dick, having said it'll take 2 or 3 years for this to kick in, wouldn't there be a phase-in period in which you'll be able to hopefully fine-tune it, or in fact even override it perhaps within an hour on Beacon Hill?
There's no phase-in period built into the cap, and whether or not it takes effect in the first year really depends on what growth is in the economy. It could take effect with a vengeance in the first year, or it might miss, depending on what happens to actual growth in the economy in the first year.
Next
In
year-
terms of modifying it, if the cap is adopted by the voters, and say by an overwhelming margin, we'll be able to modify it if Barbara says so, just as we've been able to modify Proposition 2.5 if Barbara says so, but not if the legislature says so.
No, it isn't if
all of-
Barbara says so. It's if the
All
voters out there...
all of the changes
If the
that have
voters
been
out
made
there don't
to
mind.
Proposition 2.5 up in this to this point have been personally approved by Barbara.
But
There
whose
haven't
fault,
been other
whose fault is that?
additional-
Is it now lack of courage on the part of the legislature?
I think the problem at the present time is that if we have a situation in which the legislature, speaking of courage, has the courage to adopt a responsible cap prior to this vote, so that the voters can look at the differing impacts of the one that's proposed on the ballot and one proposed by the legislature. If the legislature, in fact, has the courage to do that, and I've been working very hard to try to get them to do that, then I think we might have a situation in which you would see responsible sorts of legislative action in the future.
This is not courage, folks. The legislature has been around for 206 years, and in those 206 years there has not been the slightest interest whatsoever in doing a tax cap until suddenly, 30 days from now, we are on the ballot with a people's tax cap, and suddenly they're all running around trying to find some way to stop us.
But arguably,
And
that's how the process maybe works, that there's something that they're resistant to, they see something that they may be more resistant to, and they move toward it. One of the things I'm interested in is public opinion. When Proposition 2.5 passed, we were Taxachusetts, and there was a certain groundswell for that. Now we're not Taxachusetts. There's a lot of people that are employed. They're doing pretty well. So on one hand, they may be a little resistant. But on the other hand, they do look at the legislature, and Senator, you might admit, they might think to themselves, well, maybe we should limit that. So I'm wondering, what do you think is going to happen on the question? If there is no tax cap passed between now, well, give me a courageous answer. What do you think is going to be the result when people have a chance to limit government spending?
I think if the legislature does not act and does not pass a responsible cap of itself, that the voters probably will vote to support this referendum item. I think that's because, in general, the idea does appeal. I don't think it will be because of the specifics of this particular cap. And that's why I hope that we will be in a position where we do provide an alternative and a responsible one. You notice that Barbara got very excited when I suggested that we might, in fact, provide an alternative. And I think that's because of how people, in fact, do feel now. I think they do see the idea of a tax cap as a reasonable thing. I don't think they're at all excited by the one that's on the ballot. I think that they can be shown, that the flaws in it can readily be shown, and that there is a very good chance that if we put a responsible one in place by the legislature, that this might be defeated.
It's exactly the opposite,
and
Andy.
that would create a
a
lot of excitement.
We have about a minute and a half left. Why don't you take 45 seconds to make a closing argument?
I think people are going to sense that their intelligence is being insulted here. I mean, nobody wanted a tax cap till we got something on the ballot, and now they're all pretending they want a tax cap. And I think that sort of indicates that they don't have a lot of respect for the intelligence of the average voter, people like me, and I guess, get a little excited about that. All our limit says is state tax revenues can't go up any faster than the growth in wages and salaries. The reason we're doing this is to force the legislature to set priorities. We're going to try to stabilize the economy and lock in our gains so that we don't have to have a fiscal crisis and then a tax revolt and all this disruption. We want a stable economy with lots of jobs, with a steady source of revenue for local aid and other state programs. The only way to do it is limit their access to our money so that they don't overspend in these good times.
Senator Kraus, you get the last word.
And I think Barbara's problem in this is that we have had a responsible legislature. We have had a legislature that has delivered government spending which has stayed underneath the growth of wages and salaries in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We've had budgets at the state level that have exceeded that, only because we have been moving large amounts of money to the local level of government in Massachusetts, which needs that in order to have a fighting chance to match reasonable levels for expenditure.
Thanks very much for a spirited debate. Also thanks to our panelists this afternoon, Joan Vernacki from the Boston Globe and Jim Simon, State House Bureau Chief from Associated Press. I'm Andy Hiller. The election is November 4th. Please vote.
This has been a WBZ TV News and Public Affairs presentation.